May what I say and what you hear be in the name of God. Amen. So I've decided I'm going to continue walking down this road of 1 Corinthians 15, Paul's chapter. It's on the resurrection and what it is, and it's probably, now not probably, it really is the only place in the New Testament that you get any lengthy description about the resurrection. So here's the stage. Paul wrote this letter to the church of God in Corinth. So he's writing to Christians. And yet, when you read this, the passage from 1 Corinthians that we read today, apparently there were Christians who didn't believe in the resurrection. And hence, Paul is writing the way he's writing. Now, it's therefore not a new thing to encounter people who ostensibly are Christian and yet don't believe in the resurrection or even God. Jack Spong, the one-time bishop of Newark, made a career out of what he didn't believe in, wrote books about it. I think he made a pretty good living. He's been retired for some time now. More recently, Greta Vosper, I believe is her name. She's a pastor in the United Church of Canada. Been in the news lately for being an atheist. And there's a picture of her. I'm sorry, I can't do it without smiling. She's standing in front of a cross inside of her church and apparently preaching about, well, nothing, because she doesn't believe in God. So I want to talk to you about the resurrection, go over some of the more common arguments against it and some answers to that, and then briefly go through how it is that we can, I'm not going to say believe in the resurrection in the sense of it being proof, because history's not science, history's not repeatable. You can't go into a lab and with test tubes and whatnot, recreate everything. But history's never like that. But there are things that historians rely on to come to a conclusion that whatever it is they're reading is historically plausible. So I want to go over that with you. So to do this in a sermon, needless to say, I'm going to be skimming off the surface of this stuff. N.T. Wright wrote an 800-page book on the resurrection. So I can't possibly go into all the detail. But just one other thing, I want to say this to you because, especially if you're a parent, if you're like me and a lot of other parents, your kids get older and then suddenly they stop believing. And they are coming up against some of these arguments against the resurrection, and they're saying to themselves, oh, well, okay, it's silly to believe in the resurrection. We all know no one's raised from the dead. And so their faith begins this crash and burn spiral. So I hope to give you at least some tools, some places to go to help you in having a conversation with your children. So some arguments against the resurrection that are raised pretty frequently. The first one is the resurrection was a common belief in Jewish and pagan religions. Well, not in the pagan religions. In Judaism, yes. There is a tradition of resurrection in Judaism in the Second Temple period, which is the period after the exile, and through and even after the time of Jesus. Some Jews, by no means all Jews, believed that there would be a resurrection of the dead at the end of time. That resurrection would involve, if everyone, at least the righteous dead. But not all Jews believe that. No one, and this is important, no one in Judaism ever believed and ever imagined that one person or even a group of people would be raised in the middle of history. So in that sense, Jewish belief in resurrection mirrors and parallels that in the pagan world. And in essence, it doesn't happen. A lot of people will try to pull the wool over your eyes and say that resurrection is a common belief in other religions, and it's flat out wrong. If you go to the Wikipedia article on resurrection, what you'll read is resurrection is a concept of coming back to life after death. That is highly misleading. The word resurrection, the Greek word anastasis, which is the name of a song we're going to sing later, means bodily life after death in this world. It is a word that could also refer to someone who is really sick being made completely whole. So a person is restored to their normal self through some sort of healing. And with that concept, Jews could apply it to the resurrection of the dead to mean, here's the extreme example of someone who's sick being brought back to life in their normal way, in their normal body here in this world. Resurrection was never a word that referred to life after death in a general sense. It was a very specific word. So in the pagan world, to the extent that there was a Bible, maybe it could be Homer, and Homer flat out says, no, there is no resurrection of the dead. And the basic tenet in paganism is that death is a one-way road. The classical ancient world, when it spoke of resurrection, it denied it. And it referred to the coming back to life in the same way that we normally think of life. So even in the pagan world, the Greek word refers to bodily life after death. To just say one more thing about the Wikipedia article, if you go through that article and go to the etymology, which is ostensibly a breakdown of the various words that are used in antiquity for the word resurrection, they only discuss the Latin. They don't say anything about the Greek, and it's a good thing, because their argument falls to pieces. Resurrection was a very specific word, and it meant only one thing. So, another common argument against the resurrection is, I'll call this sort of cognitive dissonance. The disciples believed in Jesus so thoroughly that they could not face the fact of his death and instead claimed that he was alive. Within the world of Judaism, it's really, really hard to accept that as historically plausible. And here's why. Again, knowing what we know about the word resurrection and what it means. In Judaism, between 150 BC and 150 AD, there were many messianic movements. And when those messianic leaders were killed, Jews had one of two options at that point. They could, go home dejected because they, bet on the wrong horse, or they could try to find another Messiah. None of them ever said that their leader had been raised from the dead. Now, some people could have said that their leader was still the Messiah, even though he was killed. And it seems that some of the followers of John the Baptist believed that about John the Baptist after he was beheaded. But they didn't say that he was risen from the dead. They simply wanted to insist that he was still the Messiah. And to which the other Jews around would have said, well, I'm happy for you that you think he was the Messiah, but clearly he wasn't. Okay? So, to the extent that believers in or followers of John the Baptist wanted to insist that he was the Messiah, that would be an example of cognitive dissonance. not a bunch of Jews saying that their leader had risen from the dead. Related to this, the disciples in this cognitive dissonance had a profound new experience of grace, a sense in their heart, kind of like Wesley. The heart was strangely warmed and they felt forgiven, and that somehow Jesus was still alive. Well, the problem with this is vocabulary. There were ways of talking about that kind of experience in antiquity. There were ways of describing a spiritual experience or an encounter with someone who had died, but the word resurrection was not part of that language. I'd point you to Acts chapter 12. Now, there, Peter had been arrested, and some of his followers assumed that he had been killed. But Peter escapes prison and makes his way back to where his friends are and goes up to the home where they're staying, and he knocks on the door. And one of the women in the house run to the door, hear Peter's voice, and is so excited that it's Peter. Instead of opening the door to let him in, she runs back in and tells the men, "It's Peter at the door." And they say, "You're out of your mind." And she keeps insisting. And in 12 verse 15, they say to her, "It must be Peter's angel." That's the kind of language you would use if someone was encountering in some spiritual, non-physical way someone who had died. They would not use the language of resurrection. People of antiquity were scientifically unsophisticated. We know better now, with all of our scientific knowledge, that people are not raised from the dead. To which I would refer you back to number one. You don't have to have any science at all to know that no one comes back from the dead. It doesn't happen. And people didn't believe that it happened. The only story in Greek mythology that comes even close to resembling resurrection is a story involving Hercules and a woman by the name of Alcestis. Hercules brings Alcestis back to life. Now, that's a story of mythology. No one seems to have really taken it literally because there were no prayers that ever came up as a result of this. No one ever prayed to Hercules that he might do for them what he had done for Alcestis. That never happened. There were stories in antiquity of gods that died and rose again. Yes, there were all kinds of stories like that. But ordinary mortals never thought that it would apply to them. So they didn't have to have science to know that people don't come back from the dead. Christianity was born in a world in which people don't come back from the dead. And finally, the contradictions. There are contradictions in the resurrection accounts. Yes, there are. Okay, here you go. There's a story about two theologians named Laurel and Hardy. And they had a debate at a university. And at some point in the debate, Hardy got really upset with Laurel and stormed out. Now, the people who were there had different accounts of what happened. Some said that Hardy had gone to the fireplace. Now, this is an old university where it's a big, huge room. It's not like a modern auditorium, okay? So they're in this big, huge room with an old fireplace, and Hardy walks over to the fireplace. There's no fire in it, but he picks up the poker and threatens Laurel with it. Other people said that Hardy went to pick up the poker and held it up in the air to make a point and then put it back and left. Other people said, no, that didn't happen at all. He just got up and left. Now, I've told you this story using the names of Laurel and Hardy because I can't remember the actual names of the theologians. Does it mean that it didn't happen because I used the names of Laurel and Hardy? No. Does it mean the fact that people disagree about what happened mean that it didn't happen? No. All it means is Hardy left, and we're not sure what the circumstances were about why he left, but he left, and there really was a debate. Well, the same kind of thing happens with all history. All historians routinely encounter contradictions, things that don't seem to line up the way they should. People who want to use this argument seem to believe that history can be recorded objectively as if it were on a video camera. But recording history doesn't work that way. And of all people in our generation, in our day and age, we should know by now that even when there is a video of what happened, people can't agree on what happened. And my what do they call that in law? Exhibit A, the NFL replays. Huh? Right. Well, the camera shows it, well, maybe the ball hit the ground, but on this angle, no, it doesn't really. It's as if the referee can go up to a video of what happened, and anyone who looks at that video is going to come to the same conclusion. No. Okay? So that's how history works, folks. Different women, the gospel writers differ on who were the women that went to the tomb. Well, okay, they differ. Does that mean that no women went to the tomb? No, it doesn't mean that. It means that maybe we're not entirely sure which women were the first ones there. But if, in fact, you wanted to pull the wool over people's eyes and tell a story that really wasn't true, the last thing you'd do was have women in the story. To be the first to discover the risen Jesus. So those are just some of the common ones. All right, so what about an argument for the resurrection? So, right, so I've already described to you what resurrection, to the extent that Jews believed in it, what they believed was a general resurrection that would occur at the end of time, that would involve either all the dead or at least the righteous dead. People differed. By no means did all Jews believe in the resurrection. The question from an historical point of view are what conditions would be necessary in order for these Jews with that kind of belief to alter and adjust that belief and say that one person was raised in the middle of history. What would it take to convince people to do that? And N.T. Wright uses what's called necessary and sufficient conditions. This is a line of reasoning that can be applied to a lot of things, not just to this. So here's how necessary and sufficient conditions work. Necessary is a condition or something that has to be the case for the conclusion to follow. For example, it is a necessary condition for my computer to function correctly that it have an electrical supply. Right? That's an example of a necessary condition. So a sufficient condition is something that will absolutely and without fail bring about the conclusion. So it is a sufficient condition for me to have a sleepless night if someone were to play the bagpipes outside my bedroom window. That will, without fail, keep me awake. But we can see how this works by looking at alternatives. We can say that electricity is a necessary condition in order for my computer to work, but it is not a sufficient condition because there are any one of a number of other things that could go wrong with the computer and it would not work. So we could say that electricity is a necessary but insufficient condition for the computer to work properly. And with regard to the bagpipes, we could say that, well, the bagpipes are a sufficient condition, but it's not necessary because a jackhammer will also do the job. Okay? So bagpipes are a sufficient condition but unnecessary. So what N.T. Wright argues, and I am persuaded, is that both the empty tomb and the appearances together create necessary and sufficient conditions to explain how Jews who believed in a particular kind of resurrection came to adjust that and apply it to Jesus. They're both necessary and sufficient. The empty tomb by itself, people would have said, well, that's puzzling and tragic, but the body could have been robbed. I mean, that could have been grave robbery, was pretty common, so you could come up with an easy explanation for that. If the tomb wasn't empty, but people had met Jesus somehow, the response to that would have been, well, that was a vision. It was an angel of Jesus. It was an hallucination. And if you have a new experience of grace, they would have said, well, I'm really glad for you. But that doesn't mean that someone rose from the dead. Because we can go over to the tomb and there's the body. But if you have an empty tomb and people encounter Jesus, encounter him bodily, encounter him in a way that suggests that he is in every way been brought back to an embodied life, you'd need both in order for the Jews to come to that conclusion. It's therefore highly probable that Jesus' tomb was indeed empty on the third day, and that his disciples did indeed encounter him, giving every appearance of being well and truly alive. And last thing I'll say, you might be thinking at this point, well, what about Paul? Paul, when he was persecuting Christians, certainly heard the stories about the empty tomb and the appearances. And there had been no reason to deny or say that those stories were not true. No one had ever really refuted them. And Paul knew about the ascension. So the bodily resurrection of Jesus was something, the encountering of this Jesus occurred for a period of time and then it stopped. Jesus ascended, and it was after that Paul was converted. And here in 1 Corinthians 15, Paul is insisting that what we're talking about is bodily. Of all people who could say, well, it really is a spiritual thing. We're talking about some sort of life after death that's going to be wonderful, and it's going to be a new experience of grace, and it's just going to be great, but it's not going to be bodily. Paul could say it because that was his experience with Jesus. But no, it's bodily. And he hammers that point home. That, my friends, is why you can believe in the resurrection. No, it's not scientific proof, but it's as close as historians can get to saying anything about history is true. As Paul said, but Christ has indeed been raised from the dead, the first fruits of those who have fallen asleep. Amen.